All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to, this is the first of the Neo-Agate Labour Studies Units seminar series for the year. The Neo-Agate Labour Studies Unit is named after Dr. Neil Hudson Agate. He was a trade unionist who in the early 1980s was killed in an apartheid prison by the police. His death was an important moment in the development of the trade union movement in the 80s. There was a 1-hour general strike to commemorate and protest his death. And that was really a major moment in the coming together of the labor movement in the 80s and a sign of it flexing its muscles against the apartheid state. Now, our seminar series covers labor studies in a broad way. Labor history is, of course, important. We also look at issues like labor markets, workplaces, the larger political economy that affects working class people. So when we say labor studies, it's broad. And also itself, we have a wide range of interests, and we're more a hub to promote work on labor than something that is particularly specialist. We don't even have to agree with each other. So we really stress a pluralist democratic practice. We think disagreement's a good thing, and we favor having a lot of work on different areas and different views on different things. So with that out of the way, at this first seminar this year, we're very pleased to welcome Henry. Dr. Henry D has worked on the life story of Clements Kadalie for around 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. The book that you see before you is the product of many years of work. Henry traced the life of Clements Kadalie, who was born in Malawi, then Nyasaland, who in South Africa founded the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union of Africa, which in the 1920s exploded across South Africa. Exact estimates of its numbers, we don't know, and partly its records were terrible, but perhaps 250,000 people. And not only was the ICU, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, a force in South Africa, remarkably, it existed and spread into Namibia, Eswatini, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. And it was still going, I don't know, strong, but it was still a functioning, effective organization in the 1950s. And in the 1920s, it vastly overshadowed the ANC, the African National Congress, and the Communist Party of South Africa. One reason it's important to look at this is we often look at history from the perspective of the present. And because of where we are now, it seems perhaps inevitable that the ANC and the Communist Party would emerge as the victors. But at once upon a time, they were also rands. They were the guys that weren't quite making it. And when we start to step out of a sort of presentist mode of looking at things from what they look now and assuming they always looked like that, it's kind of eye-opening. Now, Henry's work in Malawi, South Africa, archives in the UK and elsewhere, I'm sure he'll tell you, has tracked the story of the ICU through the life of the man who was at its center. And that dialectic between the organization and the individual, and the complexities of people, even political people, is part of what makes his story so interesting. I don't want to say anything more about his topic. I just want to mention that Henry is widely published. He's worked on all sorts of things. For example, he'll talk about his work on this, but he's done comparisons of labor in Asia, Africa. He's looked at the connections between workers. Now, for example, the ICU's links to trade unions in India. And he's at the moment working around issues of the politics of migration. And he brings to it a historical bent. So even if you're a sociologist, societies change over time. And there's a point at which it's sociology and a point at which it's history. That point isn't always very clear. What we're going to do is Henry will do his presentation. Henry, I don't know, I told you you can have a certain amount of time, and then we'll take questions and answers from the audience. That includes people joining us online. I'd like to welcome them as well. Subsequently, there will also be a podcast and a video edited of this. Okay. I don't think there's much else I can say. Henry, the floor is yours. Let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thanks very much to Prof. Lucien van der Wel for inviting me here today, and also to Valence for helping organise it. It's really nice to be here, Makanda. Lucien was sort of one of the first people to sort of help me introduce the topic, and was really incredibly generous, talking me through this sort of huge treasure trove of sources that exists in his office, and it's really nice to be back here to talk about the ICU. And yeah, so I'll just load up my slides. Is that okay? Is that right?
No, let me help you.
Okay.
No worries.
So I suppose, yeah, I'll. Great. That's perfect.
It's fine. Yeah, double check.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, major discount. Yeah, so I'm talking today broadly about this book which just came out at the end of last year with Liverpool University Press, Clements Kadalie, the ICU and the mass movement of black workers across Southern Africa, and it's going to come out with Wits University Press in paperback in a few months towards the end of the year. So there will be like an affordable South African copy available soon. Yeah, so in the next 20 minutes or so, I just wanted to briefly outline who this guy, Clements Kadalie, and the ICU were. Then use a few Makanda-based connections to then reflect on the three main arguments of the book. So in the mid-1920s, Clements Kadalie was famous across the world as somebody who had achieved the impossible, had organised black workers across Southern Africa on an unprecedented scale. After a flurry of campaigns, strikes, mass meetings across South Africa, Kadalie had organised trade union branches from anywhere from Ludowitz in Namibia through to Cape Town along the Eastern Cape here in Makanda, into Lesotho, Eswatini, into Zimbabwe and Zambia. He had won wage increases on the Cape Town docks and in Bloemfontein, and he'd organised anywhere between 100,000 and 250,000 members, which completely eclipsed the ANC and the Communist Party at the time, which sort of struggled to organise sort of more than 3,000 to 4,000 people each. And in doing so, Kadalie garnered a huge amount of press and sensationalist news coverage. So he's sort of covered in the New York Times, the Times of London. He appears on the front cover of the leading socialist and trade union newspapers in Britain, like Lansbury's Labour Weekly. He appears in W.E.B. Du Bois's crisis newspaper. So he really is sort of one of the leading figures at the time and generating a huge amount of news. And part of the reason for this is the huge membership numbers that he managed to galvanise. So I suppose in the mid-1920s, he's sort of galvanised around 30,000 workers, predominantly in urban centres of Cape Town, Johannesburg and Durban. But after, between the years 1927 and 1928, the ICU really explodes into rural areas and gains anywhere between 100,000 and 250,000 members. And although women workers are always sort of proportionally far less than their male counterparts, there are sort of indications that the ICU organises around 10,000 black women workers, which actually at the time represents by far the largest organised body of black women for most of the early 20th century. So it is also unprecedented in its organisation of women workers. So I've sort of gone around South Africa the last few weeks, and I've sort of done quite a bit on the ICU in Cape Town, the ICU in Johannesburg, the ICU in London and East London, but I hadn't really looked at the ICU in Makanda, and I suppose it is here, particularly in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and I think there's some interesting things you can tease out from the ICU's presence right here in this town. So immediately after the famous 1919 Cape Town dock strike, where 2,000 workers downed their tools and shut the docks of Cape Town down, demanding that food shouldn't be exported from the town, Hamilton Cry, who works with Kadalie during the dock strike, he comes here to Makanda and he sort of talks through what happened. He says, talks about how people were forced back to work. There were 20 arrested, and then he moves this motion of a 10-shilling minimum wage and threatens a general strike. So it's interesting how the conversations reverberate from Cape Town through to Makanda here. The Makanda is kind of interesting in a way as well, because it's sort of a headquarter for a number of sort of anti-Kadalie dissidents. So whereas in a lot of spaces across South Africa, everyone's sort of following Kadalie's line. Actually, a lot of people here in Makanda are a bit sort of more critical of Kadalie. So very quickly in 1920, there's a split, and Kadalie's more radical ICU wins a successful wage increase in Cape Town in August 1920, sort of militantly threatening strikes. But there's a rival body, the ICW, the Industrial and Commercial Amalgamated Workers Union, which is a lot more moderate and sort of anti-communist in its politics. But they have their sort of annual conference here in Makanda in 1924, and they pledge loyalty to the king. They want to sort of criticise communism, but they do demand better wages for railway workers and pledge to send a deputation to the government. There isn't a huge amount else on Makanda until the 1930s, but it's in the 1930s that this branch really seems to sort of become a lot more active. And I suppose Lucien has talked a lot about sort of different chronologies. So the ICU in Zimbabwe and Zambia is actually a lot more prominent in the late 1920s and 1930s, and that's also the case here in Makanda. So in January 1930, there is a big dock strike, or a big strike amongst dock workers and railway workers in East London, demanding an improved minimum wage. And there's huge protests going through the town. And there's very militant pickets, and it's interesting the role of women within these pickets. There's sort of up to 3,000 workers go on strike. So the strike starts on the railways and the docks, but it very quickly spreads to a general strike, which sort of follows the ICU syndicalist tendencies to say, okay, right, well, if we're going to call an effective strike, it can't just be within a single industry. We need to shut down the whole town. And women workers are very prominent, sort of militantly picketing the docks and threatening to beat up or kill people who undercut the strike. But on the second week of the strike, Kadalie is arrested alongside the rest of the strike committee. And after a few weeks in prison, they're transported here to Makanda. I was just going through the Grokot Daily Mail, and the local newspaper covers the trial in quite a lot of detail. And this is a picture of the ICU strike committee here in Makanda in like April 1930 as they await trial. And even though the strike committee is arrested, the strike actually continues into May 1930 in East London, and it sort of doesn't win the wage increases they expect. But interestingly, in the midst of the depression, authorities reduce wages elsewhere on the sort of southern African seaboard, but in East London, they say, okay, right, we're not going to reduce wages because workers have been so militant and they're more likely to strike. So even though it's sort of like not an obvious victory, there are some marginal gains that they get from the strike. But Kadalie then returns here back in Makanda in April 1930, and significantly, he's found guilty on one count of inciting violence, and that crucially makes him liable to deportation as a Malawi-born political leader. And I think that, in a way, is an important moment in his individual career, because having become liable to deportation, he actually becomes a lot more moderate. So he had up to this point been sort of calling for revolution, particularly sort of in the late 1929, 1930, he'd been invoking Lenin, invoking Trotsky, saying that in response to sort of repressive legislation from the South African government, we need to call a general strike and use underground methods. But after he loses this trial here in Makanda, he becomes a lot more moderate. And that's maybe one of the major criticisms of his later life, particularly from the Communist Party, is that he becomes a moderate sellout. The ICU has numerous splits, and it's interesting here in Makanda, then it's a sort of a dissident branch of the ICU continues here in Makanda from 1930 to 1935 under the leadership of this guy, Joel Magadi. And Magadi is quite an interesting figure. He sort of talks about 99 members being in the ICU here in Makanda in 31, and claims up to then 500 a few months later. And by mid-1932, actually, Makanda is one of the few sort of remaining branches of the independent ICU in the Eastern Cape. And Magadi, I suppose, his sort of main sort of characteristic is he's an ardent follower of Marcus Garvey, sort of the black nationalist leader based out of New York, who rises to worldwide fame in the 1920s, so pushing these ideas of race pride, black nationalism, and race unity. So he has articles in the ICU press in 1925 saying, yeah, we've got to follow Marcus Garvey's policy of Africa for the Africans, and we need to organise everywhere. And it's interesting, I think, this sort of Pan-Africanist Garveyite politics also informs his politics in terms of migration. So the ICU is quite famous for standing up and defending immigrant workers here in South Africa, and Kadalie is one of the most sort of outspoken proponents of saying, okay, no, we need to organise everyone, and we need to reject this anti-immigrant politics that's being pushed within the ANC and by Kadalie's critics. So he explicitly makes that point in a speech in 1929. I suppose as part of his rise and fall, Kadalie nevertheless makes a lot of enemies, and he falls out with Kadalie over money in June 1932, and expels Kadalie from what is then the independent ICU over sort of the misuse of money. And Kadalie drunkenly complains that they've decided not to be led by a foreigner anymore. So it's just this accusation that other independent ICU leaders turn away from this sort of pro-immigrant position and become anti-immigrant. It's interesting then the gender dynamics within this split, because at the bottom there, the men showed no sympathy towards Kadalie. So the male members of the independent ICU are really pissed off with Kadalie, but actually the women members of the independent ICU actually really stand by Kadalie and say Kadalie is a dog and we are going to kill him. So there's the split is sort of what follows gender lines in quite an interesting way. Kadalie then, interestingly, from Makanda, he sort of has an interesting correspondence into the mid-late 1930s. So I think he goes to London in the UK in the late 1930s, and he actually worked with George Padmore, the famous Pan-African leader in London, and is vice president of the Pan-African Federation for the Defence of Africans. And then he passes in 1938, not 1938 here. So he's got this interesting sort of Pan-African legacy that goes right through to his death in the late 1930s, coming out from here in Makanda. So I suppose that's the Makanda story. There's sort of, I suppose I'll now just quickly then touch on the three main arguments of the book. So within existing studies, the ICU is often invoked as an important precursor to the ANC, and particularly the sort of move to the mass nationalist politics that the ANC Youth League and embodied by sort of people like Anton Lembede, Walter Sisulu, A.P. Mdala, all who know and correspond and work with Kadalie in the late 1940s. And I suppose this argument that the ICU worked within this sort of so-called Congress movement has particularly been pushed by Helen Bradford and Sylvia Neame, who have framed the ICU as a South African nationalist movement and quote, the baby brother of the ANC. And that this has been challenged in scholarship by Lucian and working together with David Johnson and Nunif de Gurdian, who have sort of disentangled the ICU and the ANC from each other, and sort of pointed at how the ICU sort of argued for economic freedom when the ANC was arguing for political freedom, and the ICU was a lot more radical in its politics, particularly in relation to the immigrant workers. And I suppose, nevertheless, there have been some unresolved questions from this rich body of scholarship. And so part of the book is to look at how the ICU particularly approach migrant workers and this broader politics of migration across southern and central Africa, which really underpinned the regional economy of the time, and why these efforts to organise migrant workers on a huge scale ultimately failed. So the first sort of main intervention of Militant Migrants is to sort of rehabilitate Kadalie's globally significant ideas about race and class. So he's most famous as a trade union orator who sort of denigrated everyone at mass meetings, from Angel Gabriel to the Prime Minister James Herzog at the time, who he said was a damned bugger who would lose his chamber pot if domestic workers went on strike. So he makes a lot of jests and jokes, but his speeches nevertheless do contain some really important political interventions. And arguably, these are a lot more important than the sort of relatively limited industrial successes that he pulls off. So despite the fact that white governments and white trade unions at the time only sort of refused to recognise black workers as workers, the ICU sort of very much instrumentalises this sort of accelerating process of proletarianisation in the 1920s as sort of increasing numbers of workers go to towns and engage in the economy to insist that their members are the real workers of Southern Africa. And they do so by generating a huge, very rich body of radical literature, which I think has sort of generally been underappreciated. So there's a huge amount of essays in the Workers' Herald. There's some really rich cartoons by the ICU cartoonist James Christie Scott. So this is a picture of Black Samson pushing over the twin pillars of imperial capitalism and racial prejudice. There's sort of musicians, there's bands, there's mass meetings, there's dances, and they sort of very much emphasise this black working class identity that brings together women and men, immigrants and locals, Africans and colours. And in doing so, they sort of permanently change debates as well, from sort of whether black workers can be organised at all to how best they can be organised. So the ICU sort of settles this debate, which had been sort of ruminating from the 1880s through to the 1920s about, black workers are an unorganisable body. After the 1920s, that's not a debate anymore. The debate then is actually, okay, how are we going to most effectively organise black workers? Is it going to be in general unions? Is it going to be in industrial unions? Do we focus on rural areas? Do we focus on urban areas? And that's sort of the setup for the sort of debates within labour circles and beyond for the rest of the 20th century. The second sort of key intervention of the book is to really understand the migrant background of the ICU leadership and membership. So at the time, the sort of regional economy of Southern Africa is highly integrated. It's an imperial space rather than a colonial nation state space, which only really sort of takes place after the 1930s. There's huge labour flows moving across the continent, huge numbers of workers coming from Mozambique to work on the mines of Johannesburg, considerable numbers of immigrant workers coming from Zimbabwe, Zambia, to work particularly in urban spaces. Money and goods are moving across the space on a huge scale, and ships and railways connect the space, and alongside a huge number of roads, and this increasing sort of coverage of lorry loads of migrant workers coming down from Southern Africa into South Africa. So it really is an integrated economic space, and the economy works on a regional scale rather than a nation state scale in the 1920s. And this is sort of reflected on the leadership within the ICU. So Clements Kadalie is here on the left. He's born in colonial Malawi, as is the first assistant general secretary of the ICU, Peter Nyambo, who's here. So we've got two Malawians as secretary and assistant secretary. James Gouin Gums, he's born in St Vincent in the Caribbean. The vice president of the union, Emmanuel Johnson, he's from West Africa. And then Cable Motte and James C.L.R are both from Lesotho. So the sort of leadership embody this sort of transnational migrant networks that really define the Southern Africa at the time. And I suppose it's also in response to these transnational migrant networks that then the ICU organises on a transnational scale. So it has branches in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, in Lesotho. It tries to expand into Mozambique. It's sort of thwarted in those efforts. But it does so because if you're going to call a successful strike on the mines of Johannesburg or within the domestic economy amongst domestic workers in Johannesburg, you need to organise migrant workers, because half the mine workforce is from Mozambique. The domestic workers are predominantly disproportionately from Malawi in the 1920s. So you need, if you are going to call an effective general strike, you need to engage with and organise immigrant workers. And I suppose this is a sort of important differentiator, particularly in relation to the ANC. So in the 1920s, there's a number of ANC leaders who are calling for the deportation of immigrants from South Africa. And the ICU's, in stark contrast, is calling for the organisation and representation and defence of immigrant workers in South Africa, and criticises the deportation measures when they come about, and calls for the free movement of all workers across the African continent. This then is sort of linked to sort of the final and third argument of the book, that Kadalie's Malawian background is almost always invoked as sort of a curiosity or sort of an oddity. But it's actually really important. And this matters first because Malawians had a really significant and underappreciated impact on early 20th century South Africa. And second, because the considerable backlash against Malawians at the end of the 1920s was a key part of the ICU's own undoing. So the Malawians were increasingly prominent as domestic, clerical and factory workers in 1920s South Africa. And they sort of managed to get sort of a foothold on some of the best paying jobs for black workers at the time. And in doing so, they have a lot more money relative to sort of black South African workers. And they're sort of famed as ballroom dancers who sort of at places like the Inchcape Ball in 1920s Johannesburg, which is like the premier black dance venue in Johannesburg. And they're famed for sort of courting South African women and flouting money and also winning dance competitions. So this guy here is Anderson Blackway. He's a famous Malawian ballroom dancer. He wins a number of trophies. I've pictured here. He's also a leader of the Independent Chefs and Waiters Association in 1920s Johannesburg. And a striking number of Malawians were then actually very prominent as leaders within in the 1920s. And I suppose in that sense, Kadalie is actually not that exceptional. So yeah, Anderson Blackway, he's leader of the Chefs and Waiters Association. Kadalie's own uncle, Juma Richardson Albert Nkoma, he leads one of the first Pentecostal churches here in South Africa, with congregations that stretch throughout the region into Eswatini and Zimbabwe. And he's also a leader of the Nyasaland Native National Congress, which is the first Malawian nationalist organisation anywhere in Africa. He's founded in Johannesburg in 1919. And also the first branch of Marcus Garvey's association is founded by another Malawian, Wellington Kamvara, on the Rand in 1927. So Kadalie sort of actually in some ways not that exceptional. There's lots of very prominent Malawians, and particularly black South Africans are looking to sort of be this Moses figure as an outside liberator, sort of, which it maybe partly explains why sort of somebody from St. Vincent in the Caribbean is president of the ICU, and then Kadalie is the general secretary of the trade union. Prominent and successful Malawian men, though, they also face widespread allegations of, quote, stealing jobs and stealing women. And this sort of points to difficult questions around personal relationships, masculinity, family and sexuality, questions that apply to Kadalie at a very personal level, but they also apply to a plethora of other Malawian men at a more macro scale. So speaking to Kadalie's own sort of descendants and family, particularly Rhoda and Winifred Kadalie, they were keen to sort of rehabilitate the memories of their mothers, their grandmothers, their fathers and uncles who had actually suffered most from Kadalie's alcoholism and adultery. And their experiences mattered sort of not only in sort of understanding Kadalie's sort of personal life, but also in terms of the broader social change that he and other Malawians encapsulated and embodied in the late 1920s. So Kadalie marries Molly Davidson in Cape Town in 1920. They have 4 children together. He then, one of whom is Alexander Kadalie, which is here. He then moves to Johannesburg in 1925, and he has a number of affairs, including with another IC leader, Mildred Ngaiya. And then from 1926, he has another relationship with Eva Moorhead, David's grandmother, who goes on to become a very prominent woman leader within the ICU in the 1940s. But there's a lot of tension around these relationships. And in 1927, anti-immigrant, or particularly anti-Malawian riots hit Johannesburg in December 1927, leading to a number of deaths. And this is explicitly in response to the alleged womanizing of Malawians. And it's sort of in this context of rising anti-immigrant nationalism in South Africa, and also similar things in Zimbabwe and Namibia during the late 1920s and early 1930s, that this unprecedented moment when sort of the liberation struggle is led by sort of militant migrants from across Africa and the Caribbean really comes to an end. So yeah, throughout this project, I suppose the key challenge has been to reconcile these sort of unprecedented successes with the sort of inescapable failures of Clements Kadalie's life. But I think despite these failings, sort of particularly in this moment, both here in South Africa and also in Britain and elsewhere, of sort of rising xenophobia and anti-migrant violence and and a weak labour movement, his life nevertheless remains a compelling and necessary tale. Both then and now, of audacity, of solidarity, and of organised mass struggle. So I'll leave it there. Yeah, thanks.
So we'll take a couple of questions now. I just wanted to kind of also link this to some of the stuff I know that people are studying here as well. Look, the one thing is that very often, for example, in sociology, we speak about globalization and integration, but these questions aren't new. And what Henry is really pointing out is this massively integrated mobile working class in Southern Africa. And this wasn't simply just within Southern Africa, there among black workers. You had white workers organizing trade unions in Zambia. You had Mozambicans, some of whom were Goans from India, organizing trade unions. You had the Indian diaspora here as well. So there are these fascinating connections, but it raises the same thing we see today of, do you organize all workers into one thing and have a rising tide to rise all boats, or do you close off? And this is literally was where the ICU and today parties like, say, the EFF actually face a quandary. Are you for open borders or not? Are you for some sort of link between the locals and the foreigners or not? So I think it's a good challenge, and it's important to historicize something like globalization. Okay, second thing is, I think it shows the importance of not always using what we call a methodological nationalism, which is when we take a country's borders as the unit of analysis. So if we think about it, when we talk about the story of trade unions in South Africa, or the South African liberation struggle, we look at it in South Africa, right? But what happens when you have Malawians as part of that struggle, right? What happens then? What happens when you have a trade union that's in 6 countries? And it wasn't unique in this. The bank union today, SASBO, used to be in 5 countries. The white miners union was in 3 countries. So it's very complicated. These ideas are flowing across borders. And as Henry pointed out, also within the sort of larger globe. So you have people from the Caribbean. Marcus Garvey, who we mentioned briefly, many people saw him as the founder of Pan-Africanism with Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was a massive thing. A lot of it was carried into South Africa. Marcus Garvey himself, in his memoirs, says that he was radicalized on a boat when he met somebody from Lesotho who was talking about colonial conditions. Okay. By talking big, it's also important to look locally. And one of the things is the ICU is remarkable because it's in small towns and it's on the farms. It's really the only trade union that's had in that space. Hamilton Cryer was mentioned in the beginning. He came from Penny, just down the road. The ICU was often bigger in small towns like Port Alfred than in big cities like Joburg. So it's very interesting moving between these different scales of analysis, challenging our categories, and looking at how real people had to grapple with very complex issues, which are not just of historical interest, but remain quite crucial today. So with that, I think let's give Henry another round of applause. I mean, Henry, he also did a track down his life in different countries. He spoke to many people in the family. And I think it's important to remember these other stories, not just because they matter, but because it changes how we think about the present. Right? Yeah. So look, let's take some Q&A. Let's take some questions for Henry. Look, he's a nice guy. And you know, like some of your postgrads, it's not that long ago that you were working on your PhD, which is what this comes from. So, a very bold and brilliant scholar. So, yeah. Can maybe chat to him afterwards, get some tips. All right, any questions or anything? Don't be shy. Come on, just anything. Okay, so maybe Henry, you're saying the politics of the ICU is quite complicated. Do you want to maybe unpack that? Because you mentioned Garveyism, And then you've got the sort of imperial citizenship moment about the king. And then you've got this sort of, there's liberalism in it, there's syndicalism. I want to maybe unpack those politics a bit, why everybody thinks about that a bit. And then, oh, wow, there are some questions, we'll come back to them as well. Okay. It's just popped up online, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Lucian's written about the ICU as this syncretic organisation that combines numerous sort of political lineages, and I think that's probably the best way to understand it. Like, it starts very much sort of out of a sort of a British Labour sort of tradition in Cape Town, but very quickly is then infused with Marcus Garvey's ideas. So Kadalie writes from Cape in 1920 that he wants to become the great African Marcus Garvey. That sort of influence of Garveyism continues, I suppose, with Kadalie, continues to advocate for Garveyism right into the mid-1930s. So Marcus Garvey sort of, he gets imprisoned for mail fraud in 1923. So after that point, a lot of people sort of see him as coming under sort of increasing sort of poor reputation. And Kadalie himself then also moves away from the ICU supports segregationist policies in 1924, so perhaps somewhat controversially, saying that actually we need to develop along our own lines, organising within our own communities rather than sort of cooperating with other communities. But when Herzog's segregationist policies really come to bite in 1925, when African workers are increasingly sacked from the railways and the docks, then Kadalie sees that sort of segregation as a really dangerous policy and moves against sort of that race-first organising praxis towards a more sort of class-first organising practice. So for a few years, for 2 or 3 years, he actually then becomes a lot closer to revolutionary communism. He sort of says we need to emulate the workers in Russia and call a general strike and lead a revolution here in South Africa. But then he sort of also then falls out with sort of some of the leading communists in South Africa, particularly James Laguma, but also a few other figures. And it's that in that moment he breaks with the Communist Party, which is sort of one of the sort of main criticism of him, that he sort of breaks with the Communist Party in December 1926. And after that point, sort of fairly consistently advocated this idea of like constitutional international socialism. So a more moderate course, but he's nevertheless sort of meeting and working with some of the leading radicals across the world in the late 1920s. And then he sort of flirts again with revolutionary communism between 29 and 31. But yeah, I suppose he's sort of quite moderate by the end of his years. He's sort of, particularly in East London, he's in a sort of a real dogfight with the local Communist Party. So he writes his autobiography as this quite dogged anti-communist in the 1940s. So there's lots of sort of influences and trajectories, I suppose, within the ICU, and also at a local level, there's sort of different politics come to the fore. So Garveyite politics is really prominent in Namibia, throughout the Cape. Sort of more revolutionary communism is particularly prominent in Johannesburg and in Cape Town. Then there's also like a distinct moderate sort of tradition, which is sort of actually particularly here in the Eastern Cape. The Eastern Cape moderates are really quite a powerful force within the ICU. In quite an interesting way, actually, because yeah, there's an increasing number of Eastern Cape mine workers in Johannesburg in the mid-1920s, and this is where ICU's Pan-African sort of pro-immigrant organising actually comes under most strain, because you've got an established cohort of Mozambican workers on the mine who are then challenged by a younger generation of Eastern Cape mine workers. And the ICU actually sides with the latter and sort of calls actually for jobs to be limited to South Africans. So it's got this sort of interesting sort of, sometimes it argues for the defence of all workers, regardless of where they're from, but actually that vision is actually sort of quite anglophone, so it sort of defends Malawians and Zimbabweans when they come under threat, but actually they never actually really speak up for Mozambicans. So there's sort of interesting limits to think sort of through the limits of the ICU solidarity from an international perspective.
There's a question up there. It's from Sergei Shliapnikov. I hope I possibly mispronouncing it.
So like ethnic nationalism is sort of actually one of the key things that the ICU tries to completely overcome. And so in some ways, the ANC is doing that from 1912, from its foundation in 1912. And the ICU sort of also adopts its very sort of stringent criticism of what it calls tribalism, saying that that's sort of a mechanism of colonial rule, and it's only once we've rejected ethnic nationalism that we're going to sort of unite and achieve real workers' power. I suppose where the ICU is different from the ANC is that they say, okay, you need to organise on a regional level as well as a national level. So the ANC critiques sort of ethnic nationalism at a South African level, the ICU critiques ethnic nationalism at a transnational level. But it's also sort of ethnic nationalism, which is sort of actually one of its sort of real downfalls. So within Natal, KwaZulu-Natal, sort of rising Zulu ethnic nationalism really sort of undoes the ICU in the late 1920s. And there's the ICU, yes, and Natal, and the AWG champion breaks away explicitly sort of as part of this Zulu ethnic nationalism, which is really gaining traction in the late 1920s. So I suppose that's one of the forces the ICU tries to overcome, but actually it's also one of the forces that leads to the ICU's downfall.
I think my interest is looking at what you've just talked about now, the parallel organizing on a national and transnational level, and looking at that history and looking at what is happening with right now, with the, I think, growing issues in terms of South Africans with other workers from Zimbabwe and Malawi, and them not being in agreement in terms of you are working based on these wages which we reject, but you accept. How do then these two groups organize in the same movement or union? I think Prof. Lucian mentioned the fact that EFF speaks of open borders, but the people don't want that. And how do you now mobilize while you don't agree with each other, especially when it comes to the working conditions? I think when it comes to farm workers from other countries, especially Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Lesotho, they agree to any working conditions as opposed to South African workers. Now, how do we now organize together in rejecting the capital while we don't agree on most of the basic things?
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, there's another question from Jerry Mateta.
Yeah.
He's a graduate of Rhodes, by the way.
Okay. I'll read the question. Shall I read the question?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the presentation. Would it be fair to say that the ICU provided a radical, unified voice that transcended national borders to fight for workers' rights? Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'll answer that first one, and then as a launchpad to answering your question. I mean, when Kadalie's being threatened with deportation, like the ICU makes these arguments that we should be able to, like, workers should be able to move throughout British Africa and work throughout British Africa. And I suppose the ICU does try to organise on a transnational level, so very much emphasising this idea of a black working class that isn't confined by national borders. And I think it's sort of partly important to think about this as a particular moment in history when they're operating within a sort of imperial space that isn't the states in Southern Africa are consolidating, but they're not consolidated. So it's a moment when South Africa is increasingly moving outside the sort of orbit of London. But it's sort of like you have these landmark decisions in 1931 where South Africa has increased sort of autonomy, particularly as a result of the Depression. There's increasing sort of like state bodies that sort of provide work for unemployed workers. You have sort of nationalised industries. So it's a moment where the South African state is emerging, but it hasn't fully emerged. So Smuts sort of talks about buying bits of Mozambique, and Zimbabwe holds a referendum as to whether to become incorporated within South Africa. Namibia is sort of a de facto fifth province of South Africa. So this is kind of a moment where it's in flux, and these national borders aren't exactly fixed. So I suppose it's a particular moment, and also the ICU's got a particular politics to fit within that. I mean, so the ICU's response to your question about sort of how do you work with workers who accept lower wages and poorer working conditions? I mean, the ICU really pushes this idea of minimum wages, and it's a big fan of minimum wages. So that it's not immigrants that undercut wages, it's bosses who undercut wages, and that if we manage to establish minimum wage agreements across the whole of Southern Africa, then those conditions can't be undercut. So if you establish a sort of a set level, then actually they can't be undercut by these currents. So, I mean, I suppose it's like whether you can apply those arguments today. I'm not so much of an expert on them. So when I was writing this book, it seems sort of a positive moment with like SAF2 talking about, okay, we need to organise immigrant workers as well as local workers. My sense is that moment's kind of past now. But I think those arguments are still sort of possible and important to remember that people were mobilised around these sort of internationalist principles, particularly in this argument about like economic freedom, which I think is relevant today, that South Africa has achieved political freedom after 1994, but economic freedom hasn't been attained yet. Yes, that's a Malema argument, but I think there's also a longer history of people like Kadalie making that argument.
Okay, so let's take on more questions. I mean, I think with these things, always just think kind of concretely, what does it mean, you know, and actual human beings in situations like that. And one of the things you kind of talk about, and maybe you want to touch on that a bit, is this kind of intersection between the individual and an organization that's much bigger than him, that he inspires in many ways, personifies, but it's kind of more complicated. And he himself is, from what you're saying, is shifting, and his personal life and his political life are kind of complicated as well. That was the one question. The other thing is, I mean, if I understand your book correctly, there's 2 copies floating around. If you just want to have a look at the book, there will be a nice cheap paperback coming out later in the year. I want to promote that. Academic publishing, hard book covers is, yeah, you probably have to sell a kidney or something. So, but the other thing is, what does he say about global labor? Because you're talking about the Southern Africa, and you're talking very much around intersection to some extent of race and class, but it's not a pure nationalism sometimes. Some is more class, some is more nation, some is more race, some is more trans. What is he saying about, say, relation between white workers and black workers within Southern Africa, coloured workers, and then internationally between European, in the continental sense, and African workers and their relations? Because you showed stuff of him being published in the labour press in Britain, and he was associated with the ILO, the International Labour Organization, I think, and the International Federation of Trade Unions, so the Amsterdam International. So maybe you just can unpack that a bit.
Yeah, so Kadalie is, he travels to Europe in 1927, and he affiliates the ICU with the International Federation of Trade Unions. And it's interesting, he sort of goes to Europe also sort of very much pushing that the IFTU needs to unite with the Red International of Labour Union. So like the Constitutional Socialists International needs to unite with the Communist International. So although he's sort of broken with the Communist Party here in South Africa, he's actually wanting to work with communists at an international level and call for sort of one big united Labour International. I suppose lots of people have previously picked up his sort of tour around Britain and his connections with the Independent Labour Party and people like Frene Bois, who goes on to be really important within sort of anti-colonial politics in Britain. But one of the 2 different strands that the book sort of unpicks a bit more is his connections with the US and with India. So there's some really interesting sort of articles in the African American press, like W.E.B. Du Bois is sort of very excited about what Kadalie is doing in South Africa, and similarly, the biggest black trade union in the US, this Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which is railway workers in the US, led by A. Philip Randolph, who goes on to be really important within the civil rights movement. But they invite Kadalie out to the US to tour the US, and they're sort of saying that actually the largest economic organisation of black workers in the world is the ICU. So it's interesting, they're sort of very much looking to what is the global south for an inspiration for what to do in the US. Which is, I think it's interesting if you think about how influences and connections go. But I suppose at a global level, the ICU is also in this broader moment when sort of racialized workers across the world are increasingly organising and sort of challenging what is the sort of white dominance of the international labour movement. So there's the huge strikes and unions emerging in India at the same time in the 1920s, and similarly in China. And yeah, the ICU is actually quite interestingly in touch with the All Indian Trade Union Congress and sending letters back and forth. So Kadalie's in touch with N.M. Joshi, who's the leading sort of Indian labour leader at the time, and sort of Kadalie's invited to go to India to the congresses there. But I suppose part of why these sort of organising efforts fail is sort of the effectiveness of states, colonial states at the time. So Kadalie's blocked. He wants to go to Namibia, he wants to go to Zimbabwe, he wants to go to Mozambique. He's actually blocked from going to all those three spaces. So the ICU tries to organise at a transnational level regionally, but is blocked from doing so. He's also blocked from going to the US, and he's also blocked from going to India. So it's interesting that sort of these attempts to organise and work together at a transnational level are also blocked by the colonial states at the time. Yeah, I suppose this sort of connection between the personal and the political, like I think, yeah, he becomes an alcoholic in this moment of great stress. So he's sort of threatened with being lynched. He's shot at in Bloemfontein. He's arrested multiple times, and it's in this moment that he sort of turns to drink, which is sort of part of his downfall. Yeah, sort of facing increasing accusations of adultery and alcoholism and wasting money in the late 1920s, which I think does sort of put a real burden on him, and he does falter in that moment. But I think it's important to understand that he is sort of facing death threats on a fairly regular basis. But I suppose the flip side is of how he gets swept up in a moment. I think particularly after the ANC falls into disrepute in 1919, they're sort of accused of wasting money, and sort of, there's a few failed deputations to Britain. I think it's in that moment that people look to other bodies, and there's this idea of sort of Marcus Garvey at the time, promoting this idea of sort of the outside liberator and sort of a Moses figure coming down to save South Africa. And I suppose the ICU also exists in this moment of sort of crisis amongst Black South Africans as the Land Act begins to sort of come into effect, and as sort of rural capitalism is being restructured, and huge amounts of people are finding themselves unemployed. And it is this real moment of crisis. And some people look to the ICU, but interestingly, lots of other people sort of look to Pentecostalism or Zionism. And in some ways, the ICU is sort of actually one of many sort of street corner preachers who are sort of promising the millennium. So you've got sort of, Zionists and some sort of African-led churches in Johannesburg saying, we will find you salvation. So in many ways, the ICU leaders are sort of yet another sort of form of mission educated Black leaders who are sort of actually in many ways preaching from the same gospel in this moment of sort of crisis and destitution and urbanizations.
Sure. I don't want to keep asking this. So Henry, just tell us about, so the usual story of the ICU is that it's a rise and fall story. So the ICU grows to the late 20s, and then it falls apart. Depending who you read, the different reasons. The Communist Party it emphasizes that communists were expelled from the ICU. So despite the fact the ICU was very radical in some moments, they dated to them. Then you get other people who link it to corruption, which was a big thing in the ICU. And then, of course, there's structural factors, like you mentioned, states, repression, farm workers joined the ICU, often evicted. There's a lot of violence against the ICU. But how accurate is the story that it collapses? You mentioned splits, but people often lose what happens to the ICU after the early 30s. And Kadalie, you want to maybe pick up on that as a final reflection?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose the main body, the ICU of Africa, sort of really splits and fragments in between 1928 and 1929. And that's kind of when, like, the Peter Wickens, his first major study of the ICU, that's when his book ends. But I think actually there's a really interesting radical upsurge in between 1929 and 1931, where you have these huge protests, strikes, marches in Durban, in East London, and in Johannesburg, and in Cape Town as well. And actually, that's sort of it's a moment when the ICU fragments, but actually also at a local level, there's some really interesting radical politics. But I suppose part one of the sort of arguments of the book is to say that actually it's really the effects of the depression that really lead to the ICU's downfall. So in this moment of mass unemployment and destitution, people can't afford to pay their union fees. There's a huge amount of disillusionment and people move away. So it's sort of the sort of end point of the ICU has been 1931 and not in 1929. Having said that, actually, say like here in Makanda and a lot of other spaces, the ICU continues on for decades. So in Pretoria, in East London, and in other spaces, the ICU continues on into the 1950s. And say like, yeah, the first industrial strike of factory workers in East London is sort of led by Kadalie in 1947. So it is, and I think also like it's underappreciated that it is still quite a big body. So like in East London, it's has 5,000 members, which, hey, that's nothing compared to 250,000 members in the mid-1920s. But at a local level, 5,000 people is still quite a lot of people. But actually, it's sort of, I think like the ANC itself only really goes beyond 5,000 in the late 1940s. So actually, at a local level, the ICU is way bigger, even after its downfall, than say like the ANC is in the mid-1940s. So I think actually, sort of, even though it's sort of fallen from its grace, actually at a local level, it is still really important. And like, yeah, Lucian's done work on like the ICU in Zambia, only starts in Zambia after the deportation of a Malawian leader in 1932. So there's sort of, yeah, it's interesting that actually, yeah, it's not a story that ends. And it goes on to be sort of have a huge influence for generations afterwards. So the final chapter of the book sort of reflects on legacies that go from the 50s up to the 90s. And it's sort of in interesting ways, like Toivo, the Namibian leader, sort of meets Kadalie in the 1950s and is inspired by what Kadalie says in Cape Town in 1950. Sort of, yeah, in Eswatini, there's ICU's sort of taught by these radical teachers in the 1930s. There's myths of this Keramenti figure that get back to Malawi in the 1960s. So I think it's interesting thinking about sort of these ramifications, and sort of a lot of like African nationalists sort of adopt Kadalie's ideas, and they even at a global level, like C.L.R. James and George Padmore are sort of real Kadalie fans after they break with communism in the late 1930s. And C.L.R. James even says that the ICU were the equivalent of the Black Jacobins, which is sort of the sort of highest praise that James could say at the time. Yeah, I suppose within the labour movement, it's often sort of got a more complicated relationship. So at the launch of COSATU in 1985, they sing of the freedom train being derailed by Kadalie and Champion. But then at the same time, within a lot of COSATU literature, the ICU is sort of seen as a landmark sort of moment in the 1920s where it's the Black labour movement is really established. So it does, yeah, sort of the ICU goes on to sort of, and yeah, the launch of COSATU in 1985, old veterans like W.E.B, their red ICU membership cards. So there is this longer sort of legacy of influence and significance that goes right up to the present day.
There's a question here from Jeremy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, so yeah, I sort of mentioned that like the ICU was organised ostensibly about 10,000 women workers, which would make it the sort of the largest body of black women in the early 20th century. Initially, they sort of espoused this sort of respectability politics, which is the same as the Women's League led by Charlotte Makeke. But then I think interestingly, they really break with that particularly in the late 1920s and organise working women in the towns in really interesting ways. I suppose at the time you've got increasing numbers of women domestic workers, but there's also, for the most part, a lot of women are earning money in urban spaces as beer brewers, as sort of traders, as alcohol sellers, and as sex workers. And there's sort of some interesting allegations of that all the ICU women members of Johannesburg are prostitutes, sex workers. And you can, my initial sort of reading of that was, oh, this is just sort of like racist white police being prejudiced towards these black women workers. But then I was sort of interested in, there's allegations that Kadalie has syphilis. So I was just going through the reports on venereal disease in 1920s Johannesburg, and the ICU office comes up as a brothel in the areas, and this can be sort of read two ways. Yes, it sort of might be sort of Kadalie taking on this kind of pimp role and sort of trying to earn money in that sense. But I think it would also be interesting to think about sort of if and how the ICU was thinking about organising sex workers and working with sex workers in quite an interesting way. And this is partly because the ICU also gets itself entangled within sort of Marabi culture in the slums of Johannesburg and elsewhere. And it's actually very successful. This hasn't really been appreciated before, but it works with slumlords in Johannesburg in 1927 and 1928. And it blocks slum clearances. So it sort of plays a role in sort of pushing back the implementation of urban segregation in Johannesburg, which only is achieved in 1934 when the white city council is trying to push it in from the mid-1920s. And I suppose in that sense, the ICU is working with these women workers and sort of defending women's economic interests, which are very much tied up with Marabi, with sex work, with alcohol sales. And it defends that Marabi culture and allows it to be sustained into the early 1930s. And interestingly, Marabi is typically understood as this sort of defensive escapist culture, like everything's a bit fucked, so we're going to get drunk and have a good time on the weekends. But actually, the ICU politicizes Marabi in the late 1920s, and ICU marches through Johannesburg are led by saxophonists and jazz bands and pianos mounted on trolleys, sort of marching through the streets of Johannesburg. So I think it's interesting for a brief moment, the ICU is successful in sort of mobilizing and politicizing Marabi culture and doing so sort of defending women's interests in quite interesting and subversive ways. And I think part of that is this idea of if we need to organize everyone in order to pull off the successful strikes. So, and that's how we engage with women workers in this moment. But it's kind of hasn't been written about, and there's only these very fleeting archival traces, I suppose, partly because the prejudices of the colonial state, like they're not actually so much interested in what women workers have to say, but also because of the patriarchal tendencies within the ICU's own archive. So it's kind of difficult to get at, but there are some sort of very interesting hints within the archive about what was going on.
Henry, one last question. You talk, where did you get your information? Just, I think there's a lot of postgrads here, and they're thinking like, how would you research something? A lot of people are grappling with their own problems. So how the hell did you find this life story of a transnational figure in a mass movement that sprawls over borders and it's in a global imagination, but also very local? How did you research this?
Yeah, bit of a loser. I spent a lot of time in archives. But it was, yeah, I mean, the Pretoria National Archives are very rich. Like, so the state is trying to get Kadalie and other ICU leaders on sedition charges. And that means that they send along spies and informers to the ICU meetings. And initially, the transcripts of the meetings aren't so effective. So they take some of Kadalie's comrades to court, and the police lose their case. The ICU wins because they're proven not to be full verbatim accounts of what happened. So after the South African state loses two court cases, these transcripts get quite long and actually very sort of extensive and close to sort of verbatim accounts. So the South African state in Pretoria also actually has like a huge amount of very rich ICU speeches because they're trying to get these guys on sedition. So actually they do quite a good job of sort of sending 2 or 3 spies to each of the meetings, and then all the spies got to compile verbatim reports. And because ICU meetings were translated into 2 or 3 languages, I suppose that these spies do have time as well to write down, because it'll take time to translate and relay the speech in multiple occasions. So I think that the police transcripts are a very good source, and also the ICU newspaper. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of scattered all over the world. Actually, some of the best runs are like in the Library of Congress in Washington. There's some copies in London. There's some copies in the Royal National Archives, which haven't been used before. Some here. There's a few issues in Rhodes, but I mean, I've got PDFs, a fairly consistent PDF run of the whole thing, but I think that would be one of the areas of future research. I think the ICU at a local level hasn't really been, like, you could do a history of the ICU in Wakanda. I think would be super interesting. But also the ICU, like looking at non-English language sources. So I suppose one of the big weaknesses of this book is I've relied heavily on sort of English language sources. Some things have been translated from Zulu and Isixhosa, but like, I think there's a huge amount of there. Like actually half the ICU newspapers are not in English, and like if you wanted to do research in that, actually the ICU newspapers are there. There's a huge amount of rich material in Afrikaans, in Isixhosa, in Zulu, and Sesotho. So like, yeah, that if postgrads were interested in doing that, there is actually a very rich archive of ICU newspapers, which are still like largely intact.
Thank you for your presentation. I didn't get much of this issue. Sorry for coming late. Maybe we may have covered my question, but basically what I want to understand is what was the relationship, to get a sense of what the relationship may have been between these ICU guys, especially Kadalie himself, and the liberals in general in South Africa, whether black or white. I'm asking because I'm particularly interested in the history of liberalism in South Africa, but the relationship that black people had with liberalism in the 1920s, let's say from 1910 to 1955, let's say. Mm-hmm. And so there's a part where I'm not sure if it's Kadalie himself or some of the, but it's definitely some of the ICU guys who say the ANC guys are losers because basically they're hanging on the apron strings of white liberals, right? And so I wanted to get a sense of whether you know what's happening there at that ideological level. What's the relationship? What are the dynamics, if you have any sense of that? Thanks.
Yeah, so there's a big moderate wing within the ICU, and I think historically, like in previous studies, they're not as like interesting and radical and fervent as the sort of ICU Garveyites or the ICU communists. So I think actually they've been generally understudied and underappreciated. But it's the ICU moderates who actually end up seizing control of the ICU in the late 1920s. So they work with William Ballinger, the Scottish guy who comes up to advise the ICU, and it's actually the ICU moderates who sort of control the purse strings and the organisation between 1928 and 29. And Kadalie walks out of the organisation because it's dominated by moderates at the end. So I think there's an underappreciated sort of like moderate politics within the ICU, and part of that is sort of informed by sort of a more narrow South African nationalism. So these Eastern Cape moderates sort of within the ICU are sort of don't want to work with Mozambicans or mines and call for their deportation. And part of the book has been sort of look at these more sort of, or like these kind of political tendencies that haven't been rehabilitated quite so much. Having said that, I suppose the ICU radicals like Kadalie like get a huge amount of laughs from like denouncing people like Henry Selby-Msimang as a drenched chicken or a good boy. And I think they're an easy sort of pop shot to like take out. Like the ICU love to criticize the white missionaries, they love to sort of criticize the white government, but they also like to criticize the moderate good boys. So especially for like a cheap laugh and to get people riled up, they're sort of often as a pop shot Kadalie himself says emphasizes the fact he's a quote bad native, like he's not going to sort of follow these sort of good boy politics, and he sort of often rejects that kind of politics. Although he himself sort of becomes a moderate in the 1940s, I think in part in react to the competition of communists in 1940s London. But yeah, I think it's an important politics, and yeah, sort of partly it's this swing towards moderate sort of anti-immigrant nationalism that is part of Kadalie's downfall in the late 1920s and early 1930s. So there is a sort of important tendency, which sort of I suppose initially Kadalie rises to the fore, like criticizing that in the early 1920s and mid 1920s, but it's part of his undoing in the late 1920s. And there's a kind of politics that sort of then dominated the 30s and 40s South Africans.
I think we can probably start to draw it to a close. I mean, I think with any of these particular things, it's interesting to think of the bigger significance. And maybe one of the things is you've got a movement in a particular context, and it raises issues about how individuals respond to things. And I think it's this kind of messiness of the ICU. It's got different ideas, different times. But I think it warns us against sort of passive approaches. Like Kadalie is influenced by, for example, Marcus Garvey, who's from Jamaica. He's influenced by syndicalism, which is an international radical trade union movement. He's engaging with a lot of liberal ideas, and people don't just passively receive ideas, they rework them and they change them. Secondly, we need to also, I think, look at this. Kadalie is on the world stage. I mean, he's having an influence on Black politics in America. This chapter was mentioned that was in the ICU in Makana, was in the international Pan-Africanist movement alongside people like Kenyatta and I think Du Bois, or was it? Padmore? Padmore. So we also need to be really careful about this idea that the so-called global south is simply a passive recipient of things. It is also an actor on the world stage, and ideas that get changed here get exported and reworked, and then they come back again. So I think we need, again, to be very careful of a sort of methodological nationalism where we assume everything is tight, contained, and essentialist, that there is a very specific South African thing or a white thing or a black thing that's static, essential, unchanging, and predictable over time. It changes a lot there. All right, so there are 2 copies of the book floating around. When people have looked, just pass them to the front. A bit of housekeeping. Please put your names on that list going around, especially if you're from sociology. I don't know where the list is now. There's a page somewhere. There's some food outside. It's always nice. I think we catered for enough people, hey? I hope so. All right. And I think with that, Henry, if you've got any final words. All right, let's give this man a round of applause.